As you can read in the bios, Dr. Flynn is the Ira Lipman Senior Fellow for Counterterrorism and National Security Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. And most recently, the author of The Edge of Disaster, Rebuilding a Resilient Nation. Dr. Flynn is one of the world's authorities on Homeland Security and critical infrastructure protection. He has provided testimony on the Hill and served as a principal advisor to the bipartisan Congressional Port Security Caucus. Steve served as lead consultant on Homeland Security to the U.S. Commission on National Security and in the White House Military Office during the administration of George H.W. Bush. He also served as a director for global issues on the National Security Council during the Clinton administration and as Homeland Security Policy Advisor to President Obama's transition team. He is a former commander in the United States Coast Guard, that's why these guys have to hang around, and has been at the forefront of Homeland Security issues long before the attacks September 11th. Steve served as a lead consultant on border control and trade and transportation security issues for the Hart-Rudman Commission. Dr. Flynn is a regular guest on all the major news programs, including Meet the Press, 60 Minutes, to NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, The Today Show, CNN, Charlie Rose, National Public Radio, and Steve, my wife, likes to listen to you. So. He is the author of many influential articles, including cover stories in the prestigious Foreign Affairs magazine and U.S. and World Report. In his research and writing, Dr. Flynn has analyzed America's susceptibility to deadly and disruptive attacks and has proposed more effective measures to confront our current state of Homeland Security. So it is my pleasure to welcome Steve to the Woodrow Wilson School, and Steve will speak on the topic of recalibrating Homeland Security, the case for building societal resilience. Steve, please.
Thank you very much. It's a real honor to be here. This room is a little imposing. It gives me a sort of flashback of those old things of it should have a cadaver down here or something in an operating theater. Maybe I'm that. I am really honored to have the chance to talk to this community in particular, folks who know coming from a multiple cross-section of the public and private side that are sometimes people I call the professional warriors. The folks who deal with the kinds of things that most Americans rather not think much about, but clearly we should and be prepared to deal with. But my message overall is going to be one that goes beyond your community, the community of professionals, and I think this is a very important one for those of us who sort of count ourselves amongst the professional warriors to engage in, and then also hopefully to give a bit more of a framework about just how we need to go with this notion of resilience being the overarching principles in which we operate on. I want to begin with a story that I used in my book, and I just had an opportunity related to an event I did at for the Fire Department of New York here just earlier in the week. It's particularly close to this community, but it's from firefighting history. And I think there's a lesson that even though this one dates back to 1872, that should very much inform where we should be going from here on the broad range of hazards that we now put under the clumsy umbrella of Homeland Security. The story is about the second great urban fire of the 19th century. The one that everybody is familiar with, school children and so forth, is the fire of Chicago of 1871, the firestorm that destroyed that city. But lesser known is the fact that there was another such fire that took place near where I grew up in the city of Boston the following year. And it was the only successful firestorm, in fact, that had ever been fought. And that story really has so many fascinating ingredients. The hero is the chief fire engineer. His name is John Damrell. And Damrell was somebody who grew up in the construction business and worked in the volunteer fire department, and as was the custom at the time, was elected as the chief fire engineer. It's a very democratic process when they started to professionalize firefighters. Of course, some of you may know the story. Before they got into professional firefighters, which is around mid-19th century, it was a volunteer thing, and in cities you'd literally have drunken brawls as the fire companies would vie for who could get to the fire first, and usually fight with each other instead of putting out the fires in that they were confronted with. That would happen from time to time. Also, the problem was as they get to the new technology of steam engines, some of these volunteers tend to blow themselves up from time to time and others around them, so they figured they better turn this into a profession, and that's how we started to get a professional fire department. Well, John Demrell was sort of at the top of that game, and in fact, after the Great Chicago Fire, he went out to Chicago in its immediate aftermath and did kind of an after-action survey of what happened, and came back with a whole series of recommendations to the city burghers in Boston to tell them how they should get their act together so that something would not like this would not happen again. Folks in Boston wrote off those Midwesterners as folks with a bunch of wooden structures. They weren't state-of-the-art like the stone and brick and so forth here in Boston, and they told Demrell to basically go play with his fire pump trucks. They were busy. Well, as things happened, in November, it turned out to be a warm evening, actually a mild evening. In November 1872, the fire started in the commercial district, actually in a store in the corner of Kimball and Summer Streets, and it happened after hours, so the alarm wasn't set early on. And like many disasters, there was a combining things going on, and the critical one in this case, it turned out to be, was it was an equestrian flu pandemic that started out in Toronto and had come down the eastern seaboard. Now, why this was a problem, of course, in the 19th century was every workhorse was literally down for the count. If you tried to haul something, they would keel over and die. Now, given that those pump cars are pretty heavy and pulling them on cobblestone streets is a little bit challenging, losing your equestrian workforce was a real problem for firefighters. And sure enough, this fire starts, gets going, and that's one of the variables that Demrell has to deal with. He's on scene within 8 minutes of the alarm going off. And within just the first hour, he figures that he has all the makings of something that could become a firestorm that Chicago saw. And so he does something that had never been done before. He orders a telegraph sent out to all the surrounding communities. Essentially said, Boston's on fire, send help. And then over the course of the evening, that went on about 8 p.m., they managed to grab just about everybody who was able-bodied who was around to go about fighting this fire. And what he had to do was essentially right off the commercial district, that went really well with the merchants, concentrate his water and his manpower in the main squares and along the waterfront, and then the main historic structures of Boston. And they did just incredibly, we think, strenuous work of things, of breaking out blankets and mattresses and hosing them down so they could drape them on roofs to try to keep the fire from jumping across the buildings. And when these folks were beyond the peak of human endurance, at 5 a.m. the next morning, the train started rolling in from Biddeford, Maine, from New Haven, Connecticut, from Newport, Rhode Island. And in Wakefield, Massachusetts, which is 12 miles outside of Boston, these men ran with a pump car for 12 miles to bring it to help fight the fire in Boston. As a result of those reinforcements, they essentially held the line, and Boston was saved. Now, why I think that is such a compelling story for our time and for this community that I'm honored to address here today is because Demrell did something that I would argue was a very unnatural act. The unnatural act was an open, unbounded ask for help. What we're sort of trained to do as professionals is to say, we got to take care of. That's why you pay us to do this stuff. That's why we train hard to do this stuff. And in fact, if some of you amateurs get involved with it, you probably just muck up the works. There is a tendency clearly amongst, as we've evolved our professions, whether it's public health or whether it's emergency management or whether it's public safety, firefighting, EMTs, on down the line we go here, understandably to be proud of the skills that we bring to bear and to be very much concerned that we continue to hone those skills. And one of the consequences sometimes of that is to overestimate our abilities and often to underestimate, particularly in a major disaster, what can be brought to bear by reaching out. And the only part of that critical story, of course, with Demrell that made the difference, I would argue, is that he did early on make that request for help, and he was overwhelmed about how people were able to respond. I mean, it's extraordinary, of course, in our own times to think about how that could have been pulled off. Of course, in 1872, electricity is not running around here, so most people went to bed when it got dark. So when this alarm goes off, you literally had things like church bells that had to be rung. People got out of bed, found out what the word was, had to mobilize, bring equipment down to rail yards, get on it and move it, and all that had to be coordinated so the stuff could actually get there as it did, with just in the matter of a few hours. It's extraordinary to think that that could happen so spontaneously. And what I would argue, what you saw on display there, was something that I think it believes strongly is built into the DNA of Americans. And it's one that's maybe gotten a little bit frail in the current generation or the last couple of generations, and that is this idea of resilience. This idea, and I really want to think this is such an important thing to recognize as an attribute of this country. From the first settlers who came to the Virginia Capes or near my area up in Plymouth Rock, folks didn't arrive because they thought it was going to be a cakewalk. In marching across the frontier, I mean, this is the most beautiful continent, arguably, on the planet, but nature is not awfully kind to it from time to time. In the process of marching across the continent to the frontier of the West Coast, that was no cakewalk either. And we had periodic wars, and we had downturns, we had all the other trials and tribulations that societies had. But in, I would argue, America's case, every generation confronted that adversity, overcame it, and bestowed to the next generation a sense of confidence and optimism about the ability to take on the challenges that we meet from time to time. Rather than thinking that things going wrong are aberrant or wrong or somebody's at fault, there was much more of a recognition that this is, in fact, a natural aspect of our lives, and how one copes with it is really the key to one's character, both as an individual but also as a nation. And that resilience was easy to draw on in the middle of the 19th century. I think it's still in our society, but leaders have not been calling on it, largely because of, in some cases, over-professionalizing some of these skill sets and leaving some of the amateurs too far behind. So I think that's such an essential concept to recognize as a need for this more open-ended approach to dealing with the hazards that confront us and to embed it in this notion of resilience. Let me make this argument about how we need to do this focus on resilience, and let me first define it a little bit more and then make the case for this on a strategic, on an economic, and a civic level. Okay, first what I mean by resilience. I really want to emphasize here, well, one is that there are a lot of definitions out there, and there's a lot in making right now, and I don't pretend to have the definition, but I've tried to call together from a variety of literatures some of the key concepts. But one that it should not be really limited to is this idea of just bouncing back. That resilience is just what happens after something's gone wrong, and we bounce back. Right? That is a key component, comes out of the material science kind of definition of it. A material that's resilient is the ability for it to regain its form after force is applied to it here. But the real essence of resilience actually is a prophylactic piece up front. It's designing things such that they bend but don't break. And that's very important if those things are critical. So in building resilience, we first start with what I call my first R, 4 R's. My first R is robustness. Robustness is an adult-like act of us looking out and saying, what are the foreseeable risks that we're likely to confront and that a system or network is likely to face? And what have we put in place should that force, that incident play itself out? What do we have in place to mitigate the risk of the system failing, or that we'd have mass loss of life or disruption and so forth? Robustness is, in other words, the things that we design or bake into structures, networks, and ideally I would make the case for communities and our nation, so that when these things go wrong, they may bend, but they won't break. Right? So in structures, often it is hardening kinds of things, like we can imagine with buildings and so forth, or building a dam in an area where it may be subjected to the ground moving. But it also, in many times in networks, it's involves substitutability, having enough redundancy in networks that if something fails here, you can throw a switch and keep it going somewhere else. Right, so the first element of resilience is the notion that we need to look at things that are truly critical and ensure that they're robust enough to take the things that we think are probable and foreseeable hazards. The higher the consequence, the more work we usually need to do, even if the probabilities are relatively modest. There's obviously a point where the cost-benefit analysis starts to go away in terms of too low probability for us to do things. But we can do a lot more by focusing on the fact that we need to design robustness into critical infrastructures as well as into our communities and into our society. The second R is readiness. It comes more out of the military world and my Coast Guard background. But readiness is the thing you worried about is now unfolding. And you therefore both need to sense that it's happening early and communicate to all the players who are going to help you deal with it in near real time and begin to take those initial damage control or initiate some of those initial remedial actions that have to happen in place. So under that broad umbrella of readiness is it's unfolding, the thing we're worried about, and we're getting ready to deal with it. The third R I have is the recovery piece. If it's really critical, we need it back quickly. And recovery is basically getting back to full optimization. If it was important, it may have slowed down, and maybe just sort of pilot-like level. We want it back up to full form as quickly as possible. And my final R is review. We learn from disasters. We basically analyze what the lessons that we can draw from it, and then we reinvest and redesign into robustness, readiness, and how we go about the recovery. Okay, within that broad framework of readiness, I would argue that we have all the sort of critical ingredients we need to deal with the hazards, including the terrorism hazard that has animated a lot of our activities over the last few years. Let me make this case again from a strategic and then an economic and a civic, civic imperatives that are involved. First, a strategic one. This is a little bit complicated because I would argue the main way in which our government at the federal level, the lesson they drew from 9/11 was that the only way that you deal with these terrorists is essentially you take the battle to them. You hunt and destroy them because there's no hope of deterring them. As basic, I view here somehow they're all nuts. They're kind of crazy. On the one hand, you have that side. The other is it's hopeless to imagine how you could protect ourselves. This society is so big, so open, so much stuff. It's impossible to imagine how we could actually protect our own society. So therefore, the only way, as the former president, vice president often said, to win the war on terror is take the battle to the enemy. And what they often said is, we do it over there, so we don't have to do it here. And basically, we didn't do much here, largely because that was the focus of the strategy. I'm making actually the seemingly counterintuitive argument that actually the best defense may turn out to be a pretty good defense. That, in fact, the value of engaging in catastrophic terrorism on U.S. soil in terms of as a form of military warfare conducted against us is you expect a big bang for your buck. A relatively modest investment in what would be a terrorist attack against a critical infrastructure or a highly concentrated community will force the society to essentially overreact in very costly and often dysfunctional ways. And so as long as I have reasonable confidence that the society is likely to get spooked, overreact in costly dysfunctional ways, I have an incentive to want to engage in catastrophic terrorism on U.S. soil because it's a way to, in fact, confront U.S. power and weaken it. Then, alternatively, it should follow that if, in fact, that society is resilient enough that if attacks of terror happen on it, that they are fizzles and not basically cascading political, economic, societal kind of exercises in panic, then what we actually have here is not much value added for engaging in these attacks on U.S. soil. And it turns out that it's not easy to do them here. You need a footprint. And what we know of anything from post-9/11 world is the footprint, certainly for Al-Qaeda, is not very big. Otherwise, their motivation hasn't changed. What we would see is a lot more attacks. But the fact is that footprint isn't big. They have to husband this resource. If you're going to use it, you lose it. This is particularly true with suicide bombers. Okay, one round in that barrel. So if you're going to use it and lose it, you're going to scout out what is, in fact, something that's going to likely have real consequence. And if it turns out those are not soft targets, it either takes more effort to overcome it, which means there's more smoke signals being given off, there's more surveillance being done, there's more dry runs that have to happen. Meanwhile, the team has to be holed up in stash houses and so on and so forth here. All that has to happen without anybody observing it. Or they say, that's just not a soft target. The risk of failure is too high, I'll go somewhere else. And if we're focusing on the things that are truly critical, that make the prospects of success limited and the consequences limited, then the incentive for engaging in this goes down. So the case here is not the one that solves the nut problem, okay? There are nuts out there who do, acts of violence, like we have had mass murderers and other kinds of things that run around in society from time to time. We can't deal with that, but the folks who we really should be worried about, the people who are engaged with a non-state or state-sponsored potentially in catastrophic terror as a way to conduct warfare against the United States, those players get deterred in part by our not being a society that will readily, that can bend but not break under those circumstances. So that's an important element, should be a strategic element of how we think about dealing with the threat of terrorism as a strategic imperative. The second, the economic one. Increasingly, I think we're seeing more compelling evidence about this, and it turns out that, again, emphasis on resilience is not just an exercise in paranoia or pessimism. Things are going to go wrong, okay, we better plan for that contingency. What really increasingly we're finding is that the emphasis in investing in robustness and substitute or redundant systems and readiness in a, whether public or private setting, are things that have economic benefit in their own right, even if something never goes wrong. On a micro scale, we know that companies who basically plan routinely for things going badly or systems being disrupted are companies that deal with the day-to-day hiccups of the business world much better than those who don't. And so, in fact, the sort of stressors of forcing an organization to deal with some of these contingencies, business continuity and so forth, usually makes the organization behave better. People realize there are jobs that they're doing that are connected to other people's jobs, or that there's things that they're doing that are working against those other people's jobs. These inefficiencies are often spotted. You start to build these relationships, and it just creates a more nimble sort of culture, which is so important because any real business only usually thrives because it has that. That's the upfront sort of pause and nothing goes wrong. The real benefit, though, turns out to come in is when we actually do have disruptions, as the real world always throws our way. And when things do go wrong, the folks who either bend or didn't break or bounce back the quickest are the folks most likely to be rewarded by the market by essentially market share for, hey, those are the reliable players and those guys are still down for the count, I'm going with them. And we have as a lot of data, particularly in the world of supply chains, is that companies who basically, who would have thought, gee, darn, didn't have a plan, those folks, stock basically collapses, businesses, customers don't come back, and the ones that are basically up there, hello, we're still running, they do very, very well. So it becomes almost a competitive advantage for having things go wrong when you're prepared for dealing with this. This also seems to be quite true for communities. That the fact is, where people want to live and where companies are clearly wanting to invest are not places that are risk-free, but places that basically can manage those risks quite well, thank you, or get basically workers back to work or schools back up and running. I would make the case that if the one constant we're likely to see in the 21st century, which I think I'm willing to bet on, is disruptions, whether it's climate-driven, man-made, or just because stuff's so complicated, so interdependent, and so forth here, it's going to go haywire from time to time. It is the places, the communities, the states, the nation, who is resilient enough to manage that, where people are going to want to live and invest. And the places that don't do that well are places that over time are clearly not where people are going to want to live or invest. The story of New Orleans, of course, is in large part this problem. Very hard to draw people back in, not because it's exposed to hurricanes. There's lots of other places along the Gulf Coast that are exposed to hurricanes along the eastern seaboard. But when there's a sense here they can't cope with that inevitability, then you don't really want to jump back into that neighborhood with both feet. So the fact is, and maybe increasingly, chambers of commerce will be out there touting, among other advantages they bring, is that this is a community that really works well not only when the day-to-day, but when the chips go down, we work together, we pull together. And if you want to be in a place for a long time, if disruptions are constant, this is the place that you want to be. So the reality is that, again, if we really think that the forces that need to drive the need for resilience, those disruptions, hazards that are out there, the communities who do best, the companies who do best, the individuals who do best, are likely to be the folks that will prosper in a century marked by these tumultuous events, and those who don't, won't. That's my economic argument. The third element of this is a civic one. And I think this really gets at the very core of the value of engaging in this and how we need to rethink from how we've been approaching this since 9/11, particularly the Homeland Security imperative, toward a direction that is much more sustainable and likely to be much more effective. At the end of the day, most of the basic reason why we all came together as a society and as a community is because we recognize there are problems that occur from time to time that we ourselves as individuals can't handle, or as families, as independent units can't handle. We rely on each other, and we rely on certain systems and structures to be able to help manage those things from happening. The basic social contract, in other words, is primarily driven by not just the aspiration for great things, but also because of the contingency. It helps very much, thank you, when we have things go wrong, that we actually understand and we share in this obligation as communities to work together. The nature of advancing resilience requires an open process and an inclusive process, much in the way that John Damrell in 1872 tapped. It requires an outreach to our citizenry for them to ultimately be a part of what we need to do to prepare as a society and to deal with these contingencies. That means we move from the kind of need to know, secure, we'll take care of you, very paternalistic, centralized process we've been approaching security, largely since 9/11, to one that basically says we can't get there, all of us, unless we're all in this together. All hands are on deck. And how do I basically create the incentives? How do I inspire? How do I engage? Because at the end of the day, we need all of us being pulled together at the community level, up through the national level, to make this thing work. By doing that, we actually are pulling people together, and what is, I'm afraid, still a very polarized society, by focusing on those civic things that we all need to do and do well. And so I don't see a downside to this kind of overture. I see only upside. Upside on the strategic level, upside on the economic level, and upside on the civic level. And what's really remarkable is that it's now kind of 7 years plus against the 9/11 disaster when we're starting to get, I think, more into this mindset that we're just not going to be protected by basically supercharged national security apparatus. That really what was involved here, and also, by the way, there's more hazards than terrorism out there, and maybe we should be mindful of those hazards. And when we basically come to that, we're really back to some of the core roots about how this country has approached things from time to time, which is drawing on its greatest strength, the civil society. Now, I say why that's in part ironic, because I've been making the case for a while here that we as a society missed what should have been the dominant lesson of September 11th. The lesson that we basically took away, that Washington took away, and virtually all of us followed, were there are bad guys out there want to kill us here. And solution, we'll put our national security apparatus to work, we'll take them out first. And basic citizen's job was shop and travel. Now, you go out there and go about your daily lives, we'll take care of you. Send resources to Washington, and by the way, don't ask us how we're doing this stuff, because that would probably only spook you, or kind of give roadmaps to bad guys, that kind of thing. But we'll take care of you. Very much that paternal sort of centralized approach. The only successful major catastrophic attack that was prevented in the aftermath of the attacks on the Twin Towers and the slicing of the Pentagon happened aboard United 93. And on United 93, those passengers did something that was really important. First, they needed information that the passengers of the first three planes did not have, which the government did not provide them. And they got it by basically self-help, because the terrorists were not cocky enough to keep them from grabbing the phones that used to be in the center of the seats. They found out that planes were being used as missiles that day. And armed with that information, of course, they did something really quite important. Because as we know, as the 9/11 Commission found, that the likely target of that plane was almost certainly going to be Capitol Hill. And so think of this irony and also the inspirational part of all this story of 9/93. The irony is the people who had the sworn duty under our Constitution to provide for the common defense, who were gathered that morning, and Tuesday, September 9th, were themselves defended by one thing and one thing alone: alert everyday Americans who, armed with the information about the threat, charged that cockpit and prevented it from getting to its target. That is something that we should have recognized was so essential for how we deal with this threat as an ongoing concern. At the end of the day, our greatest strength isn't our second to none military. That's a great asset to have in the dangerous world we're in. The greatest asset we have is alert, engaged, everyday Americans who are made a part of our solution. I think we can do it by a little less focus on terrorism, a more broader focus on the collective hazards that confront us, moving away from sort of the security language towards one built around this notion of resilience. And I think if we start to evolve in that direction, using some of the rough categories of what we need to do out there as we go forward, I think at the end of the day, I'm confident, in fact, at the end of the day, that Americans will continue to prosper in this century, and we'll look back on the trauma of 9/11 and say we really learned the right lesson going forward. I'm hopeful that we'll see the new administration draw on some of these themes going forward. I was honored to have the chance to kibitz a bit. It's a challenged political environment to migrate from where we were to where we need to go. And part of this, I think, is going to come from people, from citizens, from groups like many where you represent, to move out of a mode which I described after 9/11 as patriotic silence. A little bit of this, okay, this was a very traumatic thing, none of us really thought of this thing before, and we'll stand essentially and wait largely for tablets to come down from the mountain or from Washington and tell us what we should be doing. She was scratching our heads most of the time going, I don't know, this stuff seems a little crazy, but we're not in the driver's seat up there. So instead move back more to our core roots. The expertise for so much of this, the skill set, the first preventers, first responders are almost always going to be outside the federal arsenal, and so we need the insights, we need certainly the energy and the commitment from beyond that, and part of it has to be a grassroots push up to say, what's the plan and how can I help? And that's something I think the communities like that we're all represented in, I know this conference here today, could do probably more of, is to insist on that we have a public dialogue about where we go from here, and that you be included as a part of that dialogue. Well, I want again honored to have had this chance to be just the midpoint of the work that's being done. I know there's a superb panel coming up here afterwards. I'm looking forward to sitting in on and learning more about on the public health side. And I thank you again for all the work that you're doing. So many of you folks who are gathered here today on the front lines, and I think we have a few minutes for questions, and I'll welcome them. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Judy Burgess. What advice would you give the new administration on its policies in Afghanistan?
Afghanistan. Well, you can see I've erred primarily on the side of the home side versus the away side. And what the story of Afghanistan is telling us a lot about the world out there is it certainly is a messy place. One of the very big challenges, which I think many in our traditional foreign policy and national security had difficult learning, is the extent to which there really is ungovernable space in the international system where non-state actors can prosper. And the challenge is sort of recovering those spaces and to have governance and working in such a way here is really hard, especially in a place like Afghanistan. So we see, of course, a whole series of cascading things. Obviously there's a drug situation and the cultivating of that. The money that provides is an arms bazaar in that neighborhood, the border region being essentially unpoliceable in lots of ways. And so much of the challenges that we're dealing with, these transnational sorts of challenges that are not what states are really well set up to do. And obviously there's an effort to try to figure that out and move forward on it here. There's been sort of one upside, certainly, of the initial effort right after 9/11 of taking out the Taliban, and that regime was quite helpful. Of course, it pushed them into the Pakistan frontier region, where we have also turned out there's less capacity to deal with them over there, or very limited capacity to deal with them today. And But one extent, of course, the folks have been pretty much forced to go to ground. They're working locally, so operating global kinds of conspiracies is problematic when you're really buried in a cave and you can't communicate with anybody. So having them on the defensive there has certainly bought us some time. It hasn't solved the problems of Afghanistan, not likely to do anytime soon. But I think if anything we're seeing with how difficult the Afghan problem has been is that this notion that somehow we'll win the war on terrorism, that somehow we'll get to a point where we'll convince non-state actors or state actors who would be willing to engage in this kind of thing that there's no upside to doing that, we can find them and we can destroy them. Well, it's a nice aspiration, but the reality is we're not going to be able to accomplish that certainly all the time, so we probably better need to have a fallback position. You know, I've been one out here a lot of times in Washington, saw folks even through the transition process, we get this right when we do a better job with intelligence. I'm all for good intelligence. All right, if we can get good intelligence is what you obviously need in order to basically tactically know who the bad guys are, and ideally you don't want to get the friendlies or you don't want to get the innocent, you want to get the people who are really the bad guys. You need that kind of capability. I made a prediction in 2001 that it would be at least 10 years before we get our intelligence act together. I'm going to stick actually in 2009 with it's going to take 10 more years to get it here because it's not going very well. So we're going to be blind for 10 years. That's a great aspiration, good intelligence. Developing it for the kind of adversary we have in the world we're in, I mean, you're in la-la land if you think that that's going to get you to the end game. So pragmatism should tell us we should better have a fallback position. We're not going to ever have Afghanistan back in, in the kind of way which give us a great deal of comfort. There's lots of other planets that are unraveling as we speak. There's a little problem we have along the U.S.-Mexican border right now. I mean, there's a whole series of challenges that means that it's likely that essentially non-state actors have access to highly destructive things could potentially do real mischief, and we should be prepared to deal with that, not just be completely focused on the preventing at all costs kind of thing. Yes?
I agree with everything you said wholeheartedly. Amen. Quarter from here. I want to talk about the alligators and swamps problem. As we look forward to the 20, 30, 40 years out, we have to have a vision about where we want to go with the construct you talked about. And right now, too many people are worried about potholes and adding an extra lane to the interstate across the country and solving our problems. Can you talk a little bit about how we develop a national vision that is more than potholes and extra lanes on the interstate?
Absolutely. This is something I'm afraid really is going to take presidential leadership to get where we're going to go, and I'm saying afraid because there's so much on its plate with problems that are challenges right now that are certainly quite compelling ones. That say, hey, boss, you have to do another thing too more, on top of that. But really, there's a real opportunity. The case that I tried to make to the incoming administration, and I'm hoping they'll come to it here, you've got to step back and frame this in a much more overarching objective. A general case in the kind of fiscal environment we're going to face for the foreseeable future, the public policy things we're likely to invest in are ones that we get twofers and threefers. We basically address more than one problem at the same time than ones that we only do one problem at a time. It's just, that obviously is a good economy and sort of good public policy to go that direction. Broadly speaking, I'm concerned that the investment we're making now in infrastructure, which is really just a very modest down payment on where we need to go as a society overall. The American Society of Civil Engineers have estimated we're about a $2.2 trillion deficit. Trillion used to scare us, but isn't that what we give to banks every month or something? Anyways, $2.2 trillion deficit is what we are right now, and being behind on the infrastructure we've inherited. That basically get it up to speed again, we'd have to put about that level of investment. Well, I made a case there that there's almost an Eisenhower-style opportunity here to combine the Homeland Security critical infrastructure imperative with the economic driver imperative with regard to improving our infrastructure. Certainly for quality of life, it makes no sense to have stuff fall apart. For safety, public safety, it doesn't make any sense, as some commuters in Minneapolis found out a couple of years ago, to have stuff fall apart. But there also is a strategic rationale, again, for building that infrastructure and making it resilient enough that it can withstand the foreseeable hazards that may confront it. So it will live its whole life cycle. So now, if the president started talking these terms, going back to the Eisenhower model, our interstate highway system, of course, came to us as the Interstate Highway and Defense Act. The challenge that Dwight Eisenhower had when he decided he wanted to make this investment into a national highway system was roads were built by states and locals, and thank you very much, they didn't want much help from the feds because, Many road crews or public works were sources of good corruption on one hand. On the other, there was concerns the system may displace Rosie's Diner, all that sort of local stuff. But what Eisenhower did is said, look, there's a national security imperative for us to get our infrastructure, road infrastructure together. We have to mobilize in time of war, or we have to evacuate quickly. We need a system that can support that. And so that gave a rationale for the federal government to play a more assertive role in basically helping to say we need a system, not just a catch can of road projects crawled across the land, and secondly, to provide the resources to make it happen. So where I see the combining of concern, the economic one right now, people concerned about jobs, infrastructure is falling apart, is a good place to combine that skill, but let's make sure we bake into those projects federal requirements that they are designed to withstand the foreseeable hazards that are likely to confront that community or the area of that structure. And therefore use the federal dollar in this case to drive things forward. And we also have a chance to green it. So we could get this threefer, as we design infrastructure to deal with the challenges we have, we improve it to make it work better commercially or for the public service provides, we can green it, and we can also make it more secure. That's an agenda that makes us not Homeland Security competing with other issues of public interest, but people start to see it as part of the overall tapestry. Again, resilience is what we need as a society to be competitive. There's a strategic value, there's a civic value, and whatever our government invests in, whether it's public health, and this is another missing area, I would argue, in the public health side, we've got to fix health care for very sound economic reasons and quality of life reasons and everything else, but also we don't have a healthcare system that can deal with mass casualty events, period. It can't deal with them at any large scale. So under those circumstances, there's an added Homeland Security rationale for us to get on with the business of getting that healthcare system fixed. And therefore, we don't have this, hopefully, again, as a trade-off or competing issue. If we think about this more holistically, we see this as a reinforcing opportunity that builds a political constituency to make it sustainable. One more.
In the context of a resilient society, have you looked at other countries and other societies, and if so, what were the lessons learned?
Absolutely. First, at the tactical level, of course, we recognize resilience in places like Israel, and also I would make a case for the UK. And basically, we see it in how the Israelis, of course, respond to suicide bombers and so forth, where as soon as they clear up the carnage, get people off to emergency care, they restore the site. There's not FBI tape around it for days, and people are pondering, and so they clear it up and clean it up and get on with things. And the notion really is that we're not going to give that adversary the benefit they want, which is to disrupt our society. And so that's a concerted effort that Israel makes in dealing with terrorism. We saw it, though, very much in play in London on 7/7, the July 7th attack of 2005. The attack on the transit system, I would argue, leans more to the concern that I've had about terrorism, evolved more towards targeting critical infrastructure with the goal of creating massive economic disruption than these spectacular acts of violence to draw attention. Blowing up a subway car is not very good for visuals. Where is it? Where did it happen? You blow up a car in a tunnel, not a whole lot of good visuals there. Mass casualties, with the explosives they had, you couldn't kill that many people. 3 cars were probably the most you could have hoped for, with the size of explosives somebody could carry on their backs. If you had those suicide bombers, why wouldn't you have Buckingham Palace of the changing of the guard? Unlimited visuals, and pretty much wide open ability to kill lots more carnage. Well, the goal was to shut down the mass transit system, which would have crippled London by hopefully causing enough disruption. And the Londoners defeated that the next day by getting on the trains. And so there's an element of here, and I'm going to go so far as to say that Al-Qaeda is not likely to target the British underground for the foreseeable future, because there was no bang for the buck. It was a fizzle. And they invested in a cell of suicide attackers, and they have virtually nothing to show for it. So it's not likely to be where they're going to go. That kind of resilience is where I think you see out there. You see it, of course, in places like around that, so the counterterrorism, but my final illustration would be Japan, which every year has a one day of the year national earthquake preparation. Goes right down to the neighborhood and the building where everybody plays a role. And, they've been a country that is affected, obviously has earthquakes, generates fires. The notion of preparedness being an all-hands evolution, that you basically stand out as a nation and address. is something that Japan has modeled for us. And again, there's no downside to that. Does it make Japan a less desirable place to live? Are people panicked and spooked? It's really just the opposite. And let me finish maybe with this key point. You know, and this really is where it animates more and more my view about how you deal with terrorism. The concern we often have about terrorism is creating that kind of panic response that is highly dysfunctional and costly for us. Always, though, that makes us understand the core elements of fear, which always requires two things. First, fear is being aware of a threat or vulnerability. Right? When we say a child is fearless, they don't know they put a hand on a hot stove, it's going to hurt, and that's a problem. So fearlessness comes in part from being ignorant. As we become aware of a threat or vulnerability, that gives us our fear factor. The second part, though, that makes fear dysfunctional for us, that usually incapacitates us or creates the panic response, is a sense of powerlessness with dealing with the threat or vulnerability. I would argue as a nation we're perhaps more vulnerable today than we were on September 11th, because for 7+ years, Washington has fanned the sense of threat and vulnerability without giving the American people something to do. Almost guaranteeing, therefore, when we have a 9/11 scale event or greater, the society will have that sense of helplessness, that sense of panic, that sense of dysfunctionality. Where the opposite, if we have been engaging, as we must do, I would argue, we empower people, and then fear is no longer unbounded. In fact, it's often just the opposite. For most of us who were raised and brought up as professional public safety or emergency planners and so forth, we feel more confident by preparing for things that are quite frightening. And it's something that the American people, I would argue, would benefit from as well if we're willing to bring them on board. Thank you so much for your time today and the work you're all doing.